In this lesson, we're going to talk about factors and multiples and what they have in common. Let's take a look at the difference between a factor and a multiple. Factors and multiples are related. Factors are smaller than or equal to the number we're starting with, and multiples are larger than or equal to the number we're starting with. So let's look at the number 6, and let's break it down into factors and multiples so we can really see the difference between these numbers. Our number 6 has the factors of 1 and 6, because 1 times 6 gives me 6, and then 2 and 3, because 2 times 3 gives me 6. Now multiples are like skip counting. So multiples are all going to be equal to or greater than my 6, and it's going to be my skip counting, or my multiplication of 6 times 1, 6 times 2, 6 times 3, and so on and so forth. So my multiples for my number 6 are going to be 6, then 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, then I have 24, 30, and so on and so forth. So you can see that my factors are all smaller than or equal to my 6, and my multiples are all greater than or equal to my 6. The one thing that they all have in common, my factors and my multiples have in common, are my actual number I'm starting with, my number 6. So factors and multiples have that number in common, but then otherwise my multiples are like skip counting but getting bigger, and my factors are dividing and getting smaller. So let's look at my factors and my multiples for my number 4. What are the factors for the number 4? The factors for our number 4 would be 1 and 4, and then what else can I multiply times to get 4? Well, 2 times 2. So my factors are 1, 2, and 4. My multiples for my number 4 are like my skip counting. So what would my first 5 multiples for my number 4 be? I would have 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20. These would be the first 5 multiples of my number 4. Now let's look at what they have in common. The one thing that they have in common is our number 4. Notice that all of our multiples are larger than or equal to my 4, while all of my factors are smaller than or equal to my number 4. Also notice that with my factors, 1 is always going to be a factor. My number 4 is a composite number because it has more than 2 factors. It has 3. My prime or composite has nothing to do with my multiples. It has everything to do with the number of factors our number has. All right, so let's take a look at the number 8, and I want to know which of these following numbers below are a multiple of 8. Think about what we just talked about in terms of multiples. So which of these numbers is a multiple of 8? In order to find what would be a multiple of 8, I might want to list some of my multiples of 8. So 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, 8 times 3 is 24, 8 times 4 is 32, and I can see that as I'm listing my multiples, my numbers are growing by 8. So when I'm looking at this list of the numbers, if I'm asking are they a multiple of 8 or not, I have to look at, well, am I skip counting by 8? 16 is a number that I find here on this list. That is a multiple of 8. My number 8 is also a multiple of 8. But my numbers 2 and 1 and 4 are not multiples of 8. Which of the following numbers are factors of 8? Remember, my factors are those numbers that I can multiply together to get a product of 8. Which of these are factors of 8? Let's go ahead and factor our number 8, or find all of its factors. So when I have 8, I could multiply 1 times 8 to find 8. I could also multiply 2 times 4 to get 8. So my factors for my number 8 are 1, 2, 4, and 8. So 4 is a factor. That's a number I can divide evenly into 8. 1 is always going to be a factor. And of course, 8 is also a factor of 8. So we have our multiples here, and our multiples are going to be skip counting or going up by 8, while our factors are going to be smaller than or equal to our number that we're starting with, and those are what we can divide evenly into our number. So that's how our factors and our multiples are connected. Now, in the last few lessons, we talked about factors solely, and we also talked about common factors, factors that numbers had that were similar, or they had in common with each other. In this lesson, because we're introducing multiples, we're going to talk about common multiples. Well, a common factor was a factor that two numbers had that were the same. So a common multiple is going to be multiples that two or more numbers have in common. In order to find our common multiples, we're going to have to list some multiples of that number. When we were finding our common factors, we listed our factors of that number. When we're finding our common multiples, we're going to list our multiples. That makes sense. Now, the difference between multiples and factors is that multiples can go on forever. I could skip counting by 4 into infinity, and I could skip counting by 6 into infinity. I don't need to do that. What I'm really looking for is about the first 5 multiples of my number and see if I have something in common. If I need to list a few more to find something in common, then that would be something that I need to do. But usually I'm able to find my common multiple within the first 4 or 5, maybe 6 multiples of my number. So let's go ahead and list some multiples of 4 and some multiples of 6. My first 5 multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. That would be my first 6. My first 6 multiples of 6 would be 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, and 36. Now, my multiples of 4 are like this. 4 is 4 times 1, 4 times 2, 4 times 3, 4 times 4, 4 times 5, 4 times 6. My multiples of 6, this is 6 times 1, 6 times 2, 6 times 3, 6 times 4, 6 times 5, and 6 times 6. So multiples are skip counting, but we also have that multiplication in there. Now, my common multiples are going to be things that they have in common, or numbers that they have in common. So when I'm looking at my numbers, and I'm finding what they have in common, I see that 4 has a 12 and 6 has a 12. So 12 is going to be a common multiple. I also see that 24 is similar between both of these numbers. So that is another common multiple. And we might be able to, if we continue to list our multiples, find a pattern there of common multiples that we would find between our 4 and our 6. But that's not really necessary. What's necessary is that we see our 12 and our 24 are common multiples between 4 and 6. Here we have the numbers 6 and 7. I want you to find some common multiples between 6 and 7. Go ahead and list the first 7 multiples of 6 and 7 and see if you can find something that they have in common. My first 7 multiples of 6 would be 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, and 42. And my first 7 multiples of 7 would be 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, and 49. When I look at all of these numbers, the one number that they have in common is 42. Now, how do I get to 42? 6 times what gives me 42? Well, 6 times 7 gives me 42. And then 7 times what gives me 42? 7 times 6. So we see that we have 42 has a factor of both 6 and 7, and that they are both, when we list our multiples, we see that 42 is something that they have in common. It's obviously something that they have in common because 42 also has common factors of 6 and 7. Okay, so our common multiple is 42. Our last problem for today, we have a word problem. Hamburgers come in packages of 6. Hamburger buns come in packages of 8. Jonathan wants to buy the same amount of hamburgers and hamburger buns. How many hamburgers does he need to buy? So how often does this happen when you go to the store and you're looking to pair something and they don't come in the same size packages? That's so frustrating because you don't want to have anything left over. Jonathan doesn't want to have any hamburgers without hamburger buns. We don't want to just eat the hamburgers by themselves. Those wouldn't be as good. So he wants to figure out, well, how many hamburgers does he need to buy in order for him to have the same amount of hamburgers and the same amount of hamburger buns? In order for us to figure that out, we got a lot of stuff going on here, but really all we're looking for is the common multiples between 6 and 8. So go ahead and list your multiples of 6 and 8 and figure out, well, what do these have in common? Okay, here I've listed the first 5 multiples of 6 and 8, and I can see what they have in common. They both have the number 24 in common, so their common multiple is 24. So if Jonathan was going to the store and he wanted to buy the same amount of hamburgers and the same amount of hamburger buns, he would need to buy a total of 24 hamburgers and 24 hamburger buns, so that he would not have any hamburgers that did not have any buns. That would be sad if we had hamburgers without buns. All right, that's our lesson for today. We talked about common multiples, and we also talked about the similarities and differences between factors and multiples. Tomorrow we're going to start talking about number patterns, and then we'll be done with chapter 5. Pretty fast chapter.